Prince Alexander stood at the tall windows of Ravenscroft Palace, watching the morning mist roll across the sprawling gardens. His wife, Princess Victoria, sat at her mahogany desk, carefully reviewing documents that would change their lives forever. The couple had been discussing this decision for months, but today felt different. Today they would finally act on their plan that would shock the entire kingdom and leave King Edward speechless. Victoria looked up from the papers, her green eyes reflecting both determination and uncertainty. She had married into the royal family 5 years ago, bringing with her a background in international law and humanitarian work. Unlike many royal spouses, she had never fully embraced the traditional ceremonial role expected of her. Instead, she had quietly built connections with various charitable organizations and had been developing what she considered her life's true calling. "Are you absolutely certain about this, my love?" Alexander asked, turning from the window. His dark hair caught the early sunlight as he moved toward her. At 32, he was the second in line to the throne, after his older brother, Prince James. For years, he had carried out his royal duties with dedication, attending state functions, supporting various charities, and representing the crown at international events. But lately, he had felt increasingly disconnected from the rigid protocols and endless ceremonies that defined his existence. Victoria nodded slowly, setting down her pen. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life. We both know this is the right path for us, for our future children, and honestly for the monarchy itself. The institution needs to evolve, and someone has to take the first step." The documents on her desk outlined their comprehensive plan to establish the kingdom's first independent humanitarian foundation, one that would operate outside the traditional royal framework. But this wasn't just another charitable endeavor. Their proposal included a radical restructuring of how royal duties could be fulfilled, allowing working royals to pursue meaningful careers while still serving the crown. Alexander picked up one of the reports Victoria had prepared. It detailed how other modern monarchies had successfully adapted to changing times, allowing their royal family members greater freedom to contribute to society in diverse ways. The research was thorough, the arguments compelling, and the potential benefits to the kingdom were substantial. Yet they both knew that King Edward, Alexander's father, would view this as a direct challenge to centuries of tradition. "Father will see this as abandonment of duty," Alexander said, his voice carrying the weight of anticipated conflict. "He's spent his entire reign trying to maintain the dignity and traditions of the monarchy. To him, our proposal will feel like we're dismantling everything he's worked to preserve." Victoria stood and moved to stand beside her husband at the window. The palace grounds stretched endlessly before them, manicured lawns and ancient oak trees creating a scene of timeless beauty and privilege. But beyond those gates lay a world facing unprecedented challenges: climate change, global poverty, refugee crises, and social inequality. Victoria felt called to address these issues directly, not from behind the protective barrier of royal protocol. "Your father is a good king," she said thoughtfully, "but he rules with the mindset of a different era. The people don't want distant figureheads anymore. They want royals who understand their struggles, who work alongside them to solve real problems. Our foundation could bridge that gap." The foundation they envisioned would focus on 3 main areas: environmental conservation, education for underprivileged children, and support for refugees and displaced persons. Victoria's legal background made her uniquely qualified to navigate the complex international frameworks involved in such work, while Alexander's royal status would open doors and attract the necessary funding and attention. Their plan went beyond simple charitable work. They proposed establishing learning centers in underserved communities, creating job training programs for refugees, and developing sustainable agriculture projects in developing nations. Most controversially, they wanted to work directly in the field, spending months at a time in various countries, living among the communities they served rather than making brief ceremonial visits. "The timing feels right," Alexander continued, reviewing their timeline. "James and Princess Eleanor are expecting their second child, which strengthens the direct line of succession. The kingdom's financial situation is stable, and public opinion polls show increasing support for a more engaged, modern monarchy." Victoria pulled out a thick folder containing letters of support from various international organizations, government officials, and even some members of parliament. She had spent 2 years quietly building relationships and gathering endorsements for their initiative. The response had been overwhelmingly positive, with many expressing excitement about the potential for meaningful royal involvement in global humanitarian efforts. "Look at this," she said, showing Alexander a letter from the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. "They're offering us positions as special envoys, which would give us official diplomatic status for our humanitarian work. This isn't just about charity anymore, Alexander. This is about serving our country and the world in a completely new way." The couple had also consulted with constitutional experts to ensure their proposal wouldn't create legal conflicts with their royal positions. The consensus was that their plan, while unconventional, was perfectly legal and could actually enhance the monarchy's relevance and public support. Alexander sat down in the leather chair across from Victoria's desk, running his hands through his hair. The weight of their decision pressed down on him. He loved his father and respected the institution of monarchy, but he also felt a deep responsibility to use his privilege and platform for meaningful change. "I keep thinking about what our children will inherit," he said quietly. "Do we want to pass down a monarchy that's increasingly irrelevant to modern life? Or do we want to give them an institution that actively contributes to making the world better?" Victoria moved to sit on the arm of his chair, placing her hand on his shoulder. They had discussed having children many times, and both wanted to raise them with a strong sense of purpose and social responsibility. The traditional royal upbringing, with its emphasis on ceremony and protocol over substance, didn't align with their values as parents. "We're not abandoning our duties," Victoria said firmly. "We're expanding them. We're showing that being royal in the 21st century means more than cutting ribbons and attending galas. It means rolling up our sleeves and doing the hard work of actually helping people." Their proposal included a detailed transition plan. They would gradually reduce their ceremonial duties over 6 months while ramping up their foundation work. They had identified capable staff members who could take over many of their current responsibilities, and they had already begun training their replacements. The financial aspects had been carefully considered as well. The foundation would be independently funded through a combination of private donations, corporate partnerships, and grants from international organizations. They would maintain a modest staff at the palace but would significantly reduce their household expenses by spending much of their time traveling for foundation work. Alexander stood and walked to the ornate mirror hanging on the wall. Looking at his reflection, he saw not just a prince, but a man ready to forge his own path. The formal royal uniform he wore seemed suddenly constraining, a symbol of the limitations he was preparing to challenge. "When do we tell him?" Alexander asked, knowing that the conversation with King Edward would be one of the most difficult of his life. Victoria checked her calendar. "He's expecting us for lunch tomorrow. I think that's our moment. We present everything together. The proposal, the research, the support letters, everything. We show him this isn't a whim or a rebellion. This is a carefully planned evolution." The palace suddenly felt very quiet around them. Through the windows, they could see the royal guards changing shifts, their red uniforms bright against the green lawns. Life at the palace continued its predictable rhythm, but Alexander and Victoria knew that after tomorrow, nothing would ever be the same. As the morning progressed into afternoon, they spent time reviewing their presentation one final time. They had prepared for every possible objection the king might raise, from concerns about royal dignity to questions about constitutional propriety. They were ready to defend their vision while showing proper respect for the monarch and the institution they both served. The sun was setting when they finally put away their papers. Tomorrow would bring either the beginning of a new chapter for the monarchy or a family conflict that could last for years. But as they stood together in their private quarters, watching the evening light fade over the kingdom they loved, both Alexander and Victoria felt certain they were making the right choice. Their decision would indeed shock King Edward, but more than that, it would challenge the entire royal establishment to reconsider what it meant to serve the crown in a rapidly changing world. The conversation tomorrow would be just the beginning of a transformation that would reshape the monarchy for generations to come. The morning of their meeting with King Edward arrived with an unusual chill in the air, as if the weather itself sensed the gravity of what was about to unfold. Princess Victoria woke before dawn, her mind immediately focusing on the presentation they would give in just a few hours. Beside her, Prince Alexander was already awake, staring at the ceiling with an expression of quiet determination. They dressed carefully, choosing their formal attire with deliberate consideration. Alexander selected his navy military dress uniform, a symbol of his service and dedication to the crown. Victoria chose a sophisticated burgundy dress suit, projecting both respect for the occasion and confidence in their decision. Every detail mattered today, as they would need to balance their roles as loving family members with their positions as royals proposing revolutionary change. Breakfast was a quiet affair in their private dining room. The usual morning newspapers lay untouched on the table, their headlines about political scandals and international conflicts seeming somehow irrelevant compared to the personal drama about to unfold within the palace walls. Victoria reviewed her notes one final time while Alexander stared out the window at the formal gardens where he had played as a child. "I dreamed about my mother last night," Alexander said suddenly, breaking the thoughtful silence. Queen Isabella had died when Alexander was 15, leaving a profound impact on how he viewed his role and responsibilities. She was sitting in her favorite garden chair, the one by the rose beds, and she was smiling. Not saying anything, just smiling and nodding as if she approved of what we're doing. Victoria reached across the table to squeeze his hand. She had never met Queen Isabella, but she had heard countless stories about the beloved queen's compassion and her quiet efforts to modernize certain aspects of royal protocol. In many ways, their current proposal felt like a continuation of Isabella's legacy. "She would understand," Victoria said softly. "From everything you've told me about her, she would see that we're trying to honor the monarchy by making it more meaningful, not less." At precisely 11 o'clock, they made their way through the palace corridors toward the king's private study. The familiar paintings and tapestries that had witnessed centuries of royal history seemed to watch their passage with ancient eyes. Victoria carried a leather portfolio containing their meticulously prepared presentation, while Alexander bore the weight of potentially disappointing the father he deeply respected. King Edward's private study was a shrine to royal tradition, its walls lined with portraits of previous monarchs and shelves filled with historical documents and ceremonial objects. The 70-year-old king sat behind his massive oak desk, still imposing despite his advancing years. His steel-gray hair was perfectly groomed, and his blue eyes, so similar to Alexander's, reflected both warmth and the calculated caution of a man who had ruled for over 2 decades. "Alexander, Victoria." The king greeted them formally, gesturing to the chairs positioned across from his desk. "I understand you have something important to discuss with me." Alexander and Victoria exchanged a brief glance before Alexander began. "Father, we've requested this meeting because Victoria and I have developed a proposal that we believe could significantly enhance the monarchy's relevance and impact in the modern world. We wanted to present it to you personally, as both our king and the head of our family." King Edward leaned back in his chair, his expression neutral but attentive. Years of diplomatic training had taught him to reveal nothing of his thoughts until he had heard everything. "I'm listening," he said simply. Victoria opened her portfolio and placed the first document on the desk. "Your Majesty, we propose the establishment of the Royal Foundation for Global Humanitarian Action. This would be an independent organization that allows working royals to engage directly in addressing critical international challenges while maintaining their service to the crown." For the next hour, they systematically presented their research, their detailed plans, and the extensive support they had already gathered. Victoria's legal training was evident in the precision of her arguments, while Alexander's passion for the work shone through as he described their vision for hands-on humanitarian engagement. King Edward listened without interruption, occasionally making notes or asking for clarification. His face remained impassive as they described their intention to spend months at a time working in refugee camps, establishing educational programs in underserved communities, and developing sustainable agricultural projects in developing nations. When they finished their presentation, the study fell silent except for the steady tick of the antique clock on the mantelpiece. King Edward stood and moved to the window, his hands clasped behind his back in a gesture Alexander recognized from his childhood. It was his father's thinking pose, the stance he adopted when wrestling with particularly complex decisions. "This is quite comprehensive," the king said finally, his voice giving no indication of his feelings about the proposal. "You've clearly invested considerable time and effort in developing this plan." He turned to face them, his expression still carefully controlled. "However, I must say that what you're proposing represents a fundamental departure from how this family has served the crown for centuries." Alexander felt his heart sink, but he forced himself to remain calm. "Father, we're not proposing to abandon our duties to the crown. We're proposing to expand them, to make them more meaningful and impactful. King Edward returned to his desk, picking up one of the documents they had presented. Alexander, when I became king, I made a solemn oath to preserve and protect the institution of monarchy. That includes maintaining the dignity, traditions, and protocols that have sustained this institution through wars, political upheavals, and social changes that have toppled other monarchies around the world. Victoria leaned forward slightly, her voice respectful but firm. Your Majesty, with the greatest respect, we believe that strict adherence to outdated protocols is precisely what threatens the monarchy's future. Public opinion polls consistently show that people want their royals to be more engaged, more relevant to their daily lives. Public opinion polls, the king repeated, a note of skepticism in his voice. Victoria, I've been reading public opinion polls for over 20 years. They shift with every news cycle, every scandal, every perceived slight. The monarchy cannot be governed by the whims of popular sentiment. The tension in the room was palpable as the fundamental philosophical difference between the generations became clear. King Edward represented the old guard, believing in the power of tradition and ceremonial authority. Alexander and Victoria embodied a new vision, one that emphasized active engagement and measurable impact. Father, Alexander said, choosing his words carefully, I understand your concerns about maintaining royal dignity, but I would argue that there's nothing more dignified than using our privilege and platform to make a real difference in the world. When people see royals working alongside aid workers in disaster zones or teaching children in underserved communities, it doesn't diminish the crown's authority, it enhances it. King Edward sat heavily in his chair, suddenly looking every one of his 70 years. You speak of real difference, Alexander, but you fail to understand the real difference that ceremonial authority makes. When I attend a state dinner, when I open a new hospital, when I receive foreign dignitaries, I'm not just cutting ribbons. I'm representing the continuity and stability of our nation. I'm providing a symbol that transcends political parties and temporary governments. Victoria could see that their carefully prepared arguments were not having the impact they had hoped. The king's resistance was deeper than mere concern about protocol. It was rooted in a fundamentally different understanding of what the monarchy should be in the modern world. Your Majesty, she said, trying a different approach, we're not asking to abandon ceremonial duties entirely. We're proposing a model where we can fulfill our traditional obligations while also contributing to society in more direct ways. Many of the younger generation expect their leaders, including their royals, to be actively working to solve the problems they face every day. The younger generation, King Edward said with a slight edge to his voice, has always wanted to change everything immediately, but institutions that last for centuries don't survive by constantly adapting to every new trend or expectation. Alexander felt frustration building within him, but he forced himself to remain respectful. This isn't about trends, Father. This is about relevance. The world is facing unprecedented challenges: climate change, global poverty, refugee crises that affect millions of people. We have the resources, the platform, and the opportunity to make a meaningful contribution. Isn't that our responsibility? Your responsibility, King Edward said firmly, is to serve the crown as your ancestors have served it. That means maintaining the dignity of your position, fulfilling your ceremonial duties, and supporting the charities and organizations that have been associated with our family for generations. The conversation continued for another hour, with both sides presenting their arguments with increasing passion but decreasing hope for resolution. It became clear that this was not simply a disagreement about strategy. It was a fundamental conflict between two very different visions of what the monarchy should be. As the meeting drew to a close, King Edward made his position unambiguously clear. I cannot and will not approve this proposal, he said firmly. I believe it represents a dangerous departure from the principles that have sustained this monarchy. I'm asking you, as your king and your father, to abandon this plan and recommit yourselves to your traditional duties. Alexander and Victoria left the study feeling devastated but not defeated. They had known the conversation would be difficult, but they had hoped that their thorough preparation and clear evidence of support would at least open the door for further discussion. Instead, they faced a direct royal command to abandon their dreams. Walking slowly back to their quarters, they passed staff members and guards who nodded respectfully, unaware that they had just witnessed the first act of what would become a defining crisis for the modern monarchy. The hallway that had felt familiar and welcoming that morning now seemed cold and imposing, as if the very walls had turned against them. In their private sitting room, Victoria collapsed into a chair, while Alexander stood at the window, his hands clenched behind his back in unconscious imitation of his father's thinking pose. The proposal that had represented months of work and years of dreams lay scattered across the coffee table, suddenly feeling more like evidence of rebellion than symbols of progress. "What do we do now?" Victoria asked quietly, voicing the question that hung heavy between them. Alexander turned from the window, his face set with quiet determination. "We make the hardest decision of our lives," he said. "We choose between obedience and conscience." The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the room, where two young royals sat contemplating a choice that would change not only their own lives, but the future of the monarchy itself. The shocking move that would ultimately force King Edward to confront the changing world was still to come, but the seeds of that decision had already been planted in the disappointment and determination born from their failed meeting. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and impossible choices, but tonight they would hold each other and mourn the easy path they could no longer take. The days following their meeting with King Edward passed in a blur of tension and careful consideration. Alexander and Victoria maintained their regular royal schedule, attending charity galas and ribbon-cutting ceremonies, but every smile felt forced, and every ceremonial duty felt increasingly hollow. The weight of their secret decision pressed down on them as they went through the motions of their traditional roles. Victoria found herself unable to sleep, spending long hours in their private study researching legal precedents and constitutional implications. The leather-bound law books that lined their shelves became her constant companions as she explored every possible avenue for their planned course of action. Alexander, meanwhile, took long solitary walks through the palace gardens, retracing the paths of his childhood while grappling with the magnitude of what they were about to do. 3 weeks after their failed audience with the king, they received an unexpected visitor. Prince James, Alexander's older brother and heir to the throne, arrived at their quarters unannounced one evening. His usually cheerful demeanor was replaced by an expression of serious concern as he settled into their sitting room. "Father told me about your meeting," James said without preamble, his voice carrying the weight of royal responsibility that would one day make him king. "He's deeply troubled by your proposal, Alexander, and frankly, so am I." Alexander poured 3 glasses of wine, a ritual that had accompanied many of their serious family discussions over the years. "I expected as much," he replied calmly. "Father sees our plan as a threat to tradition. But James, surely you can understand our desire to make a more meaningful contribution?" James accepted his wine but set it down untouched. "I understand the desire, but I question the wisdom. The monarchy's strength has always come from its stability, its consistency. What you're proposing could undermine that foundation." Victoria joined the conversation, her legal training evident in her measured response. "With respect, James, stability without relevance is just stagnation. The constitutional monarchies that have thrived in the modern era are those that have evolved with their times while maintaining their essential character. But at what cost?" James countered. "If every generation of royals decides to redefine their role based on their personal passions, we lose the continuity that makes the monarchy meaningful. Today you want to work with refugees. Tomorrow, another royal might decide their calling is in entertainment or business. Where does it end?" The conversation stretched late into the evening, touching on history, constitutional law, and the fundamental purpose of monarchy in democratic society. James presented thoughtful arguments about the risks of royal overreach and the importance of political neutrality. Alexander and Victoria countered with evidence of successful royal engagement in social causes from other constitutional monarchies. What became clear as the night progressed was that this wasn't simply a family disagreement. It represented a deeper philosophical divide about the role of inherited privilege in modern society. James, as the future king, felt the weight of preserving the institution intact for future generations. Alexander and Victoria felt equally compelled to ensure that institution remained worthy of preservation. "I love you both," James said as he prepared to leave, "but I hope you'll reconsider this path. Father isn't just being stubborn. He's protecting something precious and irreplaceable. After James departed, Alexander and Victoria sat in their quiet sitting room, each lost in their own thoughts. The conversation had forced them to confront the full implications of their decision. They weren't just choosing a different career path. They were challenging the fundamental assumptions about royal duty that had guided their family for generations. "Are we being selfish?" Victoria asked quietly, voicing the doubt that had been growing in both their minds. "Are we putting our own desires above our duty to the institution?" Alexander took her hand, feeling the diamond engagement ring that symbolized not just their personal commitment, but their shared entry into royal life. "I keep asking myself the same question, but then I think about the children we might have someday. Do we want to raise them in a system where duty means going through empty motions, or where duty means using every advantage they've been given to make the world better?" The next morning brought news that would accelerate their timeline dramatically. Victoria received a call from the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, informing her that a humanitarian crisis was developing in a conflict zone where their expertise could make a significant difference. The opportunity was immediate and urgent, requiring a 6-month commitment that would be incompatible with their traditional royal schedule. "This is it," Victoria said after ending the call. "This is exactly the kind of work we've been preparing for, but accepting it means making our choice public before we're fully ready." Alexander looked at the formal invitation on official UN letterhead. The position offered was substantial. Special Envoy for Refugee Education, with responsibility for developing emergency educational programs in crisis zones. It was meaningful work that could affect thousands of children's lives, but accepting it would require them to step away from royal duties for an extended period. "Father will see this as the final betrayal," Alexander said, though his voice carried determination rather than regret. "But Victoria, this opportunity represents everything we've been working toward. We can't let fear of his reaction prevent us from doing what we believe is right." They spent the following week in intensive preparation, knowing that once they announced their decision, there would be no turning back. Victoria used her legal contacts to ensure their constitutional position was secure, while Alexander reached out to his network of friends and advisors to prepare for the inevitable media storm. The most difficult conversation was with Alexander's private secretary, Margaret Thornfield, who had served the royal family for over 30 years. Her reaction when they explained their decision was a mixture of shock, admiration, and deep concern. "Your Royal Highness," she said, reverting to the formal address she used in times of stress, "I've served this family through many challenges, but I've never seen anything quite like this. The king will be devastated. The media will be relentless. And the constitutional questions alone could occupy legal scholars for years." Victoria nodded gravely. "We understand the risks, Margaret. But we also understand the opportunity. This isn't a rebellion against the monarchy. It's an evolution of what royal service can mean in the 21st century." Margaret's expression softened slightly. "I won't pretend to understand all the implications, but I can see your passion for this work. If you're determined to proceed, then I'll do everything in my power to ensure the transition is handled with dignity and respect for all involved." The logistics of their announcement required careful choreography. They decided to inform King Edward personally before making any public statements, despite knowing his reaction would be explosive. They also planned to brief Prince James and other senior royals, giving the family time to prepare their own responses before facing media questions. The night before their planned announcement, Alexander and Victoria hosted a quiet dinner for their closest staff members. The meal was both a farewell and a thank you to the people who had supported their royal duties and who would now need to adapt to dramatically changed circumstances. "You've all become family to us," Victoria said as the evening drew to a close. "What we're doing doesn't reflect any dissatisfaction with our life here or with the wonderful people who've made that life possible. It simply reflects our belief that we can serve our country and our world more effectively in a different capacity." Their head chef, a jovial man who had prepared countless state dinners, raised his glass in an impromptu toast. "Your Royal Highnesses, in all my years of service, I've never seen royals who cared as deeply about making a real difference. Whatever comes next, you'll have our support and our respect." As their guests departed, Alexander and Victoria were left alone with the magnitude of what tomorrow would bring. They had crossed the Rubicon in their minds weeks ago, but tomorrow would make their decision irreversible and public. Victoria found herself drawn to the portrait of Queen Isabella, that hung in their private study. Alexander's mother gazed down from the canvas with the serene expression that had made her beloved by the people. According to family stories, Isabella had privately questioned many royal traditions while publicly supporting them with grace and dignity. "Do you think she would approve?" Victoria asked, standing before the portrait. Alexander joined her, studying his mother's painted face. "I think she would understand. Mother always said that the greatest privilege of being royal was having the platform to help others. She just never had the opportunity to pursue that idea as fully as we can." They spent their final evening as traditional working royals, organizing their personal papers and preparing for a dramatically different future. Tomorrow would bring shock, controversy, and undoubtedly some harsh criticism. But it would also bring the beginning of the meaningful work they had dreamed of pursuing. As midnight approached, marking the end of their old life and the beginning of their new one, Alexander and Victoria stood together on their private balcony, looking out over the kingdom they would always love and serve, just in a completely new way. The stars above seemed to shine with unusual brightness, as if the universe itself was preparing for the extraordinary announcement that would reshape the monarchy and challenge everything the royal family thought they knew about duty, service, and the meaning of being royal in the modern world. Tomorrow, King Edward would learn that his son and daughter-in-law had made the unexpected move that would shock not just him, but the entire nation and the world beyond. The morning of their announcement dawned gray and drizzling, as if the weather itself reflected the somber mood that would soon engulf the palace. Alexander woke before sunrise, finding Victoria already awake beside him, staring at the ceiling with the expression of someone who had barely slept. Today would be the day they shocked the world and broke the heart of a king. Their appointment with King Edward was scheduled for 9 o'clock, giving them just enough time to deliver the news personally before their official statement would be released to the media at noon. Victoria had insisted on this sequence of events, arguing that whatever their differences with royal protocol, they owed the king the courtesy of hearing their decision from them directly rather than from news reports. They dressed with particular care, choosing formal attire that would be appropriate for both their private meeting with the king and the media appearances that would follow. Alexander selected his military dress uniform one final time, while Victoria chose a navy blue suit that projected both professionalism and respect. Every detail mattered today, as their appearance would be scrutinized and analyzed by media outlets around the world. Breakfast was impossible. Their household staff moved around them with unusual quiet, sensing the gravity of the day without knowing its specific nature. The morning newspapers lay unopened on their table, their headlines about international trade negotiations and parliamentary debates seeming suddenly trivial compared to the bombshell that would dominate tomorrow's front pages. At 8:30, they made their way through the familiar palace corridors, one last time as traditional working royals. The portraits of previous monarchs seemed to watch their passage with particular intensity, as if sensing that history was being made in their ancient halls. Victoria carried a simple envelope containing their formal resignation from active royal duties, while Alexander bore the weight of potentially severing his relationship with his father forever. King Edward was waiting in his private study, but unlike their previous meeting, he was not alone. Prince James stood beside his father's desk, his expression grave and concerned. The presence of the heir apparent made clear that this meeting was being treated as a formal royal proceeding rather than a family discussion. "Father," Alexander began, his voice steady despite the emotional turmoil within him, "Victoria and I asked for this meeting because we have reached a decision that we felt you should hear from us personally before it becomes public knowledge." King Edward's face remained impassive, but his hands gripped the arms of his chair with enough force to whiten his knuckles. Years of royal training had taught him to control his expressions, but his body language betrayed his anxiety about what was coming. Victoria stepped forward and placed the envelope on the king's desk. "Your Majesty, we are formally notifying you that we will be stepping back from our roles as working members of the royal family. We have accepted positions with the United Nations as special envoys for refugee education, effective immediately." The silence that followed seemed to stretch for an eternity. King Edward stared at the envelope as if it contained something dangerous, while James's face reflected the shock and dismay that his father was too well trained to show. "Stepping back," King Edward repeated slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. "You mean to abandon your duties to the crown?" Alexander felt the accusation like a physical blow, but he forced himself to respond calmly. No, Father. We mean to serve our country and our world in the capacity where we believe we can make the greatest contribution. We're not abandoning our love for the monarchy or our respect for the institution. We're choosing to serve it in a different way. King Edward stood abruptly, his composure finally cracking. A different way? Alexander, you are second in line to the throne. You don't get to choose a different way. You have obligations that transcend your personal preferences and desires. And we will continue to fulfill those obligations, Victoria interjected, her legal training evident in her precise language. We will retain our titles and our place in the line of succession. We will be available for constitutional duties as required. But we will no longer maintain the full schedule of ceremonial engagements that have defined our roles until now. James spoke for the first time since their arrival. This is exactly what I was afraid of when we spoke last month. You're creating a precedent that could destabilize the entire structure of the monarchy. If working royals can simply decide to pursue other careers when they feel like it, what happens to the continuity and reliability that the institution depends on? Alexander turned to face his brother, feeling the weight of their childhood bond and their future roles pulling in opposite directions. James, I understand your concerns, but I would argue that blind adherence to tradition without regard for effectiveness is what truly threatens the monarchy's future. The institution has survived for centuries precisely because it has adapted to changing times. Adapted, yes, King Edward said, his voice rising with each word, but gradually, thoughtfully. With respect for the wisdom of previous generations, what you're proposing isn't adaptation, it's revolution. The word hung in the air like an accusation, and Alexander felt its full weight. In his father's worldview, their decision did indeed constitute a revolutionary act, a fundamental challenge to the principles that had guided the monarchy through centuries of change and crisis. Victoria opened her portfolio and placed a document on the desk. Your Majesty, we've consulted extensively with constitutional experts about the legal implications of our decision. We are not breaking any laws or violating any constitutional requirements. We are exercising our right as British citizens to choose our careers and our service while maintaining our hereditary positions and our availability for constitutional duties. King Edward glanced at the document but did not pick it up. Constitutional technicalities, he said dismissively. Victoria, you may have found legal justifications for this action, but legality and rightness are not the same thing. You both took vows when you married into this family. You made commitments to serve the crown with your full devotion and energy. And we will continue to serve, Alexander said firmly. But we will serve by using our platform and our privileges to address the real problems facing our world. Father, you taught me that leadership means taking responsibility for the welfare of others. That's exactly what we're doing. The argument continued for over an hour, with each side restating their positions with increasing passion but decreasing hope for resolution. King Edward made clear his view that their decision was a betrayal of family, institution, and country. Alexander and Victoria maintained that their choice represented an evolution of royal service, rather than an abandonment of it. Finally, King Edward delivered his ultimatum. I cannot prevent you from taking this action, but I can make clear the consequences. If you proceed with this plan, you will no longer receive royal funding. You will no longer have official royal staff. You will no longer represent the crown at any official functions. You will, in essence, become private citizens who happen to hold royal titles. Alexander felt the finality of his father's words like a door slamming shut. I understand, Father, and I accept those consequences. Furthermore, the king continued, I want it clearly understood that this decision has my complete disapproval. I will not pretend to support what I believe is a fundamental mistake. Victoria had anticipated this moment, but experiencing it still felt devastating. Your Majesty, we hope that in time you will come to see our work as a source of pride rather than disappointment. But we understand that our decision has hurt and disappointed you, and for that we are genuinely sorry. When they left the study, Alexander and Victoria felt as if they had crossed a bridge that had then burned behind them. There was no going back now. No possibility of changing their minds or finding a compromise that would satisfy everyone. They had made their choice, and now they would live with its consequences. The next few hours passed in a whirlwind of activity. Their press secretary coordinated the release of their statement while fielding dozens of calls from news organizations around the world. Their household staff began the complex process of transitioning their duties to other members of the royal family. And Alexander and Victoria themselves prepared for their first public appearance since announcing their shocking decision. The statement they released was carefully crafted to explain their decision while showing respect for the monarchy and the king. It emphasized their continued love for their country and their commitment to service, while making clear that they believed their new roles would allow them to contribute more effectively to addressing global challenges. The media reaction was immediate and intense. News anchors interrupted regular programming to report on the unprecedented decision. Royal correspondents who had covered the family for decades admitted they had never seen anything quite like it. International news organizations sent reporters racing to the palace to capture reactions and gather expert opinions. But the most significant reaction came from an unexpected source. As Alexander and Victoria were preparing for their first press conference, they received word that Queen Eleanor, James's wife and a respected member of the royal family, had requested an immediate meeting. Eleanor arrived at their quarters with an expression that was difficult to read. As someone who had married into the royal family from a background in international diplomacy, she understood both the traditions they were challenging and the work they hoped to pursue. "I wanted to speak with you before the media storm makes private conversation impossible," she said, settling into their sitting room with the grace that had made her popular with both the public and the press. "Eleanor," Victoria began, "we hope you understand that our decision wasn't made lightly. We've thought about the implications for the entire family." Eleanor raised her hand to stop her. "I'm not here to argue with your decision. Actually, I'm here to tell you that I admire your courage, even if I question your timing." The unexpected support from Eleanor provided a moment of relief in an otherwise difficult day. As someone who had successfully navigated the challenges of royal life while maintaining her own sense of purpose, her opinion carried particular weight. "James is furious, of course," Eleanor continued. "He feels like you're abandoning him just as he's preparing to take on greater responsibilities. And the king is more hurt than angry, though he'll never admit it." Alexander nodded gravely. "I know we're asking a lot of them. We're asking them to support a decision that they fundamentally disagree with. But you know what?" Eleanor said with a slight smile. "I think this family has become too comfortable with never challenging anything. Maybe what you're doing will force all of us to think more carefully about what royal service really means in the 21st century." As the afternoon wore on and their press conference approached, Alexander and Victoria felt the full weight of their decision settling around them. They had shocked King Edward, challenged centuries of tradition, and potentially changed the monarchy forever. The move that had seemed so clear and necessary in the privacy of their quarters now felt enormous and irreversible as they prepared to face the world's reaction. But as they stood together preparing to meet the press, they also felt something else. The excitement of finally being able to pursue the work they were passionate about, the relief of no longer living a life that felt increasingly hollow, and the pride of taking a stand for their beliefs despite the personal cost. The shocking move was complete. Now came the even more challenging task of proving that their decision had been the right one. 6 months had passed since the announcement that shook the royal establishment to its core. The initial media frenzy had gradually given way to thoughtful analysis, and, surprisingly for Alexander and Victoria, growing public support for their decision. Opinion polls showed that a majority of citizens, particularly younger demographics, viewed their choice as courageous and admirable rather than irresponsible or disloyal. Victoria stood in a classroom in a refugee camp in Jordan, watching 12-year-old Amira carefully write her name in English for the first time. The girl's face lit up with pride as she showed her work to the other children gathered around the makeshift desks that Victoria and her team had helped establish. This moment, repeated countless times over the past months, had validated every difficult conversation and painful family dinner that had led to their current life. The Royal Foundation for Global Humanitarian Action, despite losing royal patronage and official funding, had become one of the most effective and well-regarded humanitarian organizations in the world. Private donors, inspired by Alexander and Victoria's personal sacrifice and hands-on approach, had contributed more money than they had ever received through traditional royal channels. Alexander was 3 time zones away, in a rural village in Kenya, working with local farmers to implement sustainable agricultural techniques that could help communities become more resilient in the face of climate change. His engineering background, combined with his ability to attract international attention and resources, had made him remarkably effective in this role. The programs he had helped establish were already showing measurable results in improved crop yields and reduced environmental impact. The separation was difficult, but both had known that their work would sometimes require them to be in different parts of the world simultaneously. They maintained daily contact through video calls, sharing their experiences and supporting each other through the challenges of their new life. Their relationship had actually grown stronger through their shared purpose and mutual respect for each other's dedication to their work. Back in the kingdom, the effects of their decision continued to ripple through the royal family and the institution of monarchy itself. King Edward had maintained his public disapproval of their choice, but those close to the family reported that he had been quietly following their humanitarian work with what appeared to be grudging respect. Prince James had initially struggled with the increased duties that fell to him after Alexander's departure from royal service. The schedule of engagements, charity events, and official functions that had once been shared among multiple working royals now fell more heavily on his shoulders. However, he had gradually adapted to his expanded role and had begun to show a new level of confidence and authority in his public appearances. Queen Eleanor had become an unexpected bridge between the separated family members. She regularly shared updates about Alexander and Victoria's work with King Edward and James, while also keeping the couple informed about developments within the royal household. Her diplomatic background proved invaluable in maintaining family connections despite the philosophical differences that had driven them apart. The most surprising development came from an unexpected source. Princess Sophia, James and Eleanor's 18-year-old daughter, had been deeply influenced by her aunt and uncle's decision. As she prepared for university, she had chosen to study international relations and had publicly stated her intention to pursue humanitarian work alongside her royal duties. "They've shown that being royal doesn't mean you can't also be useful," Sophia had told a reporter during her first solo interview. "I want to serve my country, but I also want to serve the world. I don't see why those two things have to be mutually exclusive." Her comments had sparked a new round of media discussion about the future of the monarchy and whether Alexander and Victoria's approach might become a model for the next generation of royals. King Edward had been reportedly frustrated by his granddaughter's public statements, but even he could not deny the positive public reaction to her thoughtful and mature perspective. The most dramatic moment came during the kingdom's annual state opening of Parliament, a ceremony steeped in centuries of tradition and pageantry. As King Edward delivered the Queen's speech, outlining the government's legislative agenda, he made an unexpected addition to the prepared text. In closing, the king said, his voice carrying across the ornate chamber, "I want to acknowledge that service to the crown and service to humanity can take many forms. While I continue to believe in the importance of traditional royal duties, I have come to respect those who choose to serve our values through different means." The words were carefully chosen to avoid explicitly endorsing Alexander and Victoria's decision, but royal watchers immediately recognized them as the closest thing to a reconciliation that the king was likely to offer. The statement made headlines around the world and was interpreted as a sign that the family might be beginning to heal from the divisions created by the couple's shocking departure. Victoria learned about her father-in-law's comments while teaching a literacy class in the refugee camp. The news reached her through a text message from Eleanor, who had watched the ceremony on television. For the first time in months, Victoria felt tears of relief and hope rather than frustration and sadness. Alexander was equally moved when he heard about the king's statement during a satellite phone call with Victoria that evening. "Maybe we haven't destroyed everything after all," he said, his voice thick with emotion. The reconciliation process was gradual and tentative. King Edward began including brief mentions of Alexander and Victoria's humanitarian work in his official statements about royal family activities. He never explicitly praised their decision to leave royal service, but he acknowledged the positive impact of their work and the international recognition it had brought to their country. The breakthrough came 8 months after their departure, when a devastating earthquake struck a densely populated region where both Alexander and Victoria were working on separate projects. Their foundation's quick response and effective coordination of relief efforts drew international praise, and demonstrated the practical value of their hands-on approach to humanitarian work. King Edward, watching news coverage of his son directing rescue operations while covered in dust and debris, finally understood what Alexander had meant about using royal privilege for meaningful service. The image of Alexander carrying an injured child to safety became one of the most powerful photographs of the year and demonstrated royal leadership in a way that no ceremonial function could match. The king's response was unprecedented. For the first time since their departure, he publicly praised Alexander and Victoria's work, calling their earthquake response exemplary service to humanity, and expressing his pride in their dedication and effectiveness. The statement opened the door for direct communication between father and son for the first time in months. Their first phone conversation was awkward and formal, but it marked the beginning of a slow rebuilding of their relationship. King Edward began to understand that his son had not abandoned royal values but had found a different way to express them. Victoria's relationship with the royal family had always been more complex, as she was both an outsider who had married into the institution and someone whose legal background had enabled their departure. However, her consistent grace under pressure and her obvious effectiveness in her humanitarian work gradually won over even her harshest critics within the royal establishment. The year ended with an unexpected invitation. King Edward asked Alexander and Victoria to attend the family's traditional Christmas gathering at the palace, their first invitation to a family event since their departure. The invitation came with no strings attached and no expectation that they would change their career choices, simply an acknowledgement that they remained family despite their different paths. The Christmas reunion was emotional and healing for everyone involved. King Edward, now 71 and showing signs of his age, embraced his son and daughter-in-law with genuine warmth for the first time in over a year. He spent hours listening to their stories about their work and asking thoughtful questions about their future plans. "I may never fully understand your choice," he told them privately, "but I can no longer deny its value. You've shown that royal service can mean more than I ever imagined." Prince James, too, had come to see his brother's decision in a new light. The increased responsibilities he had shouldered had actually prepared him better for his future role as king, and he had developed a deeper appreciation for the different ways people could serve their country. "You've made me a better future king," he told Alexander during a quiet moment at the Christmas celebration. "You've shown me that leadership means being willing to challenge expectations when necessary." As the year drew to a close, Alexander and Victoria found themselves in a position they had never quite dared to hope for. They had pursued their dreams, made a meaningful impact on the world, and somehow managed to maintain their family relationships, despite the initial upheaval their decision had caused. Their foundation continued to grow and expand its impact. They had established educational programs in refugee camps across 3 continents, developed sustainable agriculture projects that were helping thousands of families, and created a model for humanitarian work that other organizations were beginning to adopt. More importantly, they had sparked a conversation about the role of inherited privilege in modern society and demonstrated that people born into positions of advantage could use those advantages to make a real difference in the world. Victoria, now recognized as one of the leading experts on refugee education, had been invited to address the United Nations General Assembly about the crisis of displaced children. Alexander's agricultural programs have been featured in international development conferences as examples of effective grassroots intervention. Their shocking decision to step back from traditional royal duties had indeed stunned King Edward and challenged the monarchy's assumptions about duty and service. But it had also opened new possibilities for what royal service could mean in the 21st century and beyond. As they stood together on New Year's Eve watching fireworks over the refugee camp where they were currently working, Alexander and Victoria reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. They had given up the comfort and predictability of royal life, endured months of family estrangement, and faced intense public scrutiny. But they had also found their true calling, made a measurable difference in thousands of lives, and ultimately helped their family understand that service to the crown could take many different forms. Their love for each other and their shared commitment to making the world better had sustained them through every challenge. The young royals who had shocked a king with their unexpected decision had become global leaders in humanitarian work. Family members who had found their way back to each other despite fundamental disagreements, and partners whose love had been strengthened by pursuing their shared dreams. Their story was far from over, but they had already achieved something remarkable. They had proven that it was possible to honor tradition while embracing change, to respect the past while building a better future, and to serve their country by serving the world.